Like Jesus, we all have to die before we can be reborn. But like the kings of ancient Egypt, visiting the underground regularly renews our divine right to walk as gods upon the earth. Everything physical decays over time, but it's okay, because the science of reclamation enables the magic of resurrection. Through death, everything is reborn and regenerated, again and again. The truth in this is universal. Everything goes through this process. We shed every cell in our bodies once every 7 years. We are dying and being regenerated all the time. So there are little deaths, and then there's the big death. All healthy living beings develop by shedding our prior selves regularly. Like, think of trees, for example. And there is medicine in this metaphor for our mental, emotional, and spiritual health as well. Westerners are both bizarrely afraid of death and morbidly obsessed with it, possibly because we unrepentantly create so much of it in the world and we're reluctant to face that reality. Also, the cosmology that most of us grew up in features a terrible afterlife that anyone would be reluctant to enter into when it's compared with the relative paradise of life here on Earth. And that same cosmology, of course, continues to insist that we've been cast out of the real paradise when paradise is obviously all around us. Well, I guess the joke's on us. Our fear of death, of our own mortality, is profound and causes a variety of negative effects downstream from how we interface with death itself. Fear of death causes us to try to extend life indefinitely, which manifests in things like dangerous pharmacology, poisonous cosmetics, and of course, good old-fashioned hegemonic power structures. Dying authoritarians are the most dangerous kind, willing to sacrifice everyone else to keep their own miserable selves in power and comfort. Our cultural fear of death is linked to an obsession with it that's self-evident from the violence in our entertainment, our imperialistic tendencies around the world, and our generally bullying international posture. Americans, in particular, lead dangerous, reckless, destructive lives on the whole, but they do so in constant fear of the repercussions, as if there's no alternative. From an external perspective, this behavior appears completely pathological, both unnecessary and dangerously insane. The downstream effects of this fear lead us to do crazy things, like pump our bodies full of chemical cocktails sold to us by a power-hungry class of elites who publicly advertise their intention to cull and enslave the global population, through manufactured crisis, no less. It leads to turning a viral pandemic into a mass casualty event by suppressing information from medical professionals that are actually working in the field. Fear has been weaponized in Western culture to paralyze the attention of the population and to gain willing compliance to objectively insane and self-destructive measures which have been repeatedly demonstrated to solely benefit the same class of wealthy elites at great cost to the masses. Only an out-of-control fear of mortality would lead the state to force people to say goodbye to their families over Zoom, for example. The tragic actions that we've taken as a society in fear of our own mortality over the last few years have been so profoundly destructive that it's been demonstrably shown to have significantly increased the global suicide rate. It's been simply too fucked up to live for a skyrocketing number of people. It's a vicious cycle. Out of fear, we attempt to control the chaos of life, and we do a poor job of it, resulting in systemic problems which harm some of us more than others. And our response is to tighten controls and to produce even more ineffective, non-egalitarian solutions. This causes greater harm than it addresses, and that's just considering the human point of view. All our attempts to interfere with and dominate natural systems wreak havoc in the plant, animal, insect, and even spiritual worlds. Our attempts to control fate, and particularly to extend our lives, and therefore our control over fate, are so out of whack, so out of alignment with nature, that we prioritize a whole array of human behaviors which make no sense at all. For example, cutting down trees to sow, feed, and water grass that doesn't naturally grow in an area, simply to mow it into uniform lawns, illustrates a pathological level of conformity and is an objectively bizarre behavior. It has no precedent in nature, for sure. Worse, this strange behavior also happens to rapidly demineralize soil as grass absorbs and stores a tremendous amount of minerals. As homeowners are forced to mow and then dispose of the lawn cuttings instead of composting them, which is often prohibited for health or sanitation reasons in Western cities, the effect is to strip the minerals out of the land and to put it in non-biodegradable plastic bags and dispose of them. This robs the earth of the nutrients which all living things rely on, rapidly, and then it traps it in little plastic coffins. This is objectively insane and self-destructive behavior. As an energy healer, I'm constantly reminded that self-destructive behavior patterns are symptoms of deeper wounds that you are subconsciously trying to process and heal. It's just part of being human to work out your karmic bullshit, and this happens at the personal, generational, and even societal levels. The West's fear of death, the abandonment of the elderly and our ancestors, the weaponization of fear of mortality, and our obsession with immortality, youth, and permanence are all just manifestations of the same wound which needs healing. Ancient cultures and some other survivals like indigenous cultures and so on outside the Anglosphere, and even some of the occult corners within the Anglosphere, have always believed in immortality through resurrection into the world again, rather than into some holier than everyone else Judeo-Christian afterlife. And they had rituals for managing mortality and its implications on life, and their practices surrounding death and the underworld carry secrets that we can use today. What can ancient ideas about death tell us about how to live now? A great deal, actually. Existentially, death informs us that every moment of life is valuable, of course. But spiritually, there is a great deal more esoteric value to death than just that. Pachamama, Mother Nature, is always healing, always regenerating the world. But without death, there can be no regeneration. But there's death as a metaphor, with many little deaths taking place in a lifetime. And then there's death, big death, where we trade in our body and our birth chart and take another spin around the wheel. If you've lived for long, you've left a life behind, at least a few times, to begin again somewhere new. Pretty much everyone does this at least once. Personally, I've lived many lives already, and I've been several different people over the course of my actual physical life. Each of these versions of me lived for a time and then was put to rest at the end of a personal era, if you will. Becoming your future self means letting some part of you now die so that there's space for the new you to develop and grow. And there's a difference between shedding skin, releasing the past, and letting yourself die so that you can be reborn. One is shrugging off the dead weight, pun intended, and the other requires a more complicated process of burying, grieving, and coming to terms with the finality of it all. There are times when we all need to let ourselves die and be reborn, which is to say, to refresh our life force by ritually participating in the death cycle and experiencing how it facilitates our perpetual regeneration. For tens of thousands of years, humanity kept seasonal traditions which celebrated the cycle of life, death, and rebirth. And then, for some reason, we became obsessed with the idea of immortality without death. And this obsession has thrown us tragically out of balance with the rest of the cosmos. In this episode, I'm going to discuss this phenomenon, our obsession with and fear of death and its effects on humanity, nature, and speculate at its impact on spirit. We'll look at the natural world for inspiration on how to be in a better relationship to death, and at examples of resurrection magic in the ancient world and in South American shamanic practices that ritualize the many little deaths which force us to grow spiritually. Welcome to episode 7 of the Postmugglism podcast. Let's dig in. This is episode 7 of the Postmugglism podcast, Resurrection as Praxis. I'm Nate, aka Postmugglism, and this is my show. Thanks for tuning in. If you're new to the podcast, before you forget, please subscribe on whatever platform you're listening on, Apple, Spotify, or whatever, or if you're watching on YouTube. Just go ahead and click the subscribe button now. I promise that I'm going to make it worth your while. Thanks. In this episode, I'm going to share a constellation of related ideas with you about how we can and should harness the magical power of the cycle of life, death, and rebirth to improve our lives and move into better relationship with the more than human world. I'm going to talk about how Westerners fear death and how that fear is leading us into self-imposed misery and destroying our world. And I'm going to explore the idea that we have forgotten, or maybe abandoned, ancient rites of renewal, which are essential to the flourishing of all life on Earth. In short, I'm going to make the case that by regularly practicing what I'm calling here resurrection magic, we can renew ourselves in our environments, communities, spaces, and whatnot, and reassert our divine right to exist as humans. Before I do, though, I want to take just a second to tell you about my website and email newsletter. If you enjoyed this video, remember that you can find all my content, episodes, videos, articles, and more on my website at www.postmugglism.com. And there you can also subscribe to my email newsletter so that you'll get notified whenever I publish new content on any platform. And these days, I'm putting out a lot of free content like the weekly podcast, my monthly Lunar Mansion election guide, articles, and other one-off videos on practical magic, and so on. So definitely, please subscribe at www.postmugglism.com if you enjoyed this episode. Now let's get back to the topic at hand, resurrection magic. Death rituals have existed forever because death is just a part of life, and we've pretty much always had dead bodies around. Still, death is a special event in every culture, every life, etc. It's something that's always been handled with care, though not always in the same way. Death rites in prehistoric times were kind of horrifying by modern standards, featuring various ways to remove the organic material down to the bones, which could be preserved honorably. Sky burials were first documented as a Tibetan practice, but were most likely practiced by all civilizations that lived above the tree line and mountains in prehistoric times. And they are brutal. The body is ceremonially hacked to pieces and fed to vultures in high-up places. The bones are then recovered and buried. And while it's distasteful to us culturally, there's actually nothing fundamentally wrong with this practice, cosmologically speaking, because it does exist in right relationship with the environment where this practice developed. Egyptian mummification is also a bit weird, of course, but then again, occultists and historians both benefit from the Egyptian predilection with immortality, so we can't really judge them from our place of relative ignorance about death and the afterlife. The Egyptians, by comparison, developed very complex beliefs about death, the afterlife, and resurrection that still fascinate and inspire us today. Their process, though, is difficult to imagine from a modern perspective. Comparing our funerary practices now to how they lived then, it's obvious that they were not squeamish about death or dead bodies like we are now. But while their death rituals are unthinkable to us, our disregard for the dead, human and otherwise, and the world of spirit would be incomprehensible to them. Those of us that grew up in Western cultures have a much less complex, much less satisfying understanding of death, one that instills the fear of our inevitable mortality in us at a very young and impressionable age. That fear sticks with us throughout our entire lives and causes us to see the world through a very threatening lens. Fear of death, fear of mortality, drives people to seek immortality in this lifetime instead of through the reincarnation of spirit. And because we fear the big death, we attempt to resist aging and change in general, because change represents a little death, and we can't stand the impermanence of it, because even decay reminds us of death and triggers our feelings of aversion. Even just the metaphor of death seems to offend. Think of all the examples. We want everything clean all the time, no dust or dirt anywhere. Old things get thrown out, wear and tear is bad. We sweep dead bugs into the trash, seal dead leaves and grass cuttings in plastic, and empty the Earth's supply of carbon, which is dead dinosaurs, into the atmosphere through the petrochemical industry. Our relationship with death and dead things is terrible and deeply unnatural. For example, it's socially virtuous to promote veganism to reduce animal cruelty. And to be fair, the industrial meat industry, like all food industries, is horrific and disgusting. But veganism, led by industrial agriculture, only exacerbates the core issues of cruelty and the lack of sustainability. Monocrop agricultural systems that support plant-based foods, like soy products, for example, are far more destructive and unsustainable than industrial animal farms because of the vast tracts of previously wild land devoted to farming, the extreme quantities of toxic fertilizer and pesticides, insecticides, fungicides, etc., that are needed to ensure the uninterrupted supply. In this process, we're destroying animal habitats and driving essential insect species like pollinators and the beneficials that keep pest populations in check to extinction. And their extinction would precede our own only by a couple of years. The problems are real, but our solutions are not. Fundamentally, the people of the West are so convinced of our own superiority, our own limitless genius, that we think everything would fall apart save for our meddling. The climate crisis is a perfect example of this dynamic at work. We recognize that humanity is having an effect on the environment, and immediately we start looking for new solutions. Driven by fear, we rush potential solutions into implementation without first assessing if the premise is even a good idea in the first place. Is the solution to a future polycrisis of famine, natural disaster, and energy really to cause famine, war, and energy crisis today instead? There are so many examples of this right now. Plans are currently under discussion at the UN to experiment with filling the atmosphere with aerosolized particles, i.e. blotting out the sun to reduce global warming. A truly absurd and dystopian idea, and our obsessive attempts to control the climate are the rule rather than the exception when it comes to enforcing our will and our genius upon the natural world. Decades of increasing mental health issues spawned billions in annual pharmaceutical expansion that hasn't slowed the decline of mental health. Quite the opposite, but has permanently affected the biochemistry of many millions of people in unpredictable ways. The entire mRNA platform has been a massive failure, supported by government-subsidized fraud and marketed through constant fear-mongering. Despite the hype, though, the results are extremely underwhelming. mRNA vaccines are less effective than natural immunity, the side effects are numerous and alarming, and the pandemics they target continue to have their way with the global population, unlike any other virus for which there is a vaccine. In each instance, our solutions are worse than the original problem, but we nonetheless continue our attempts to dominate nature, despite the obvious costs. And in each instance, we can trace the root of our delusional need for control to the paralyzing fear of our own mortality that results from observing the universe through the lens of materialist reality. As mystics and magicians, we are uniquely positioned to escape this vicious cycle because we know that there are forces beyond the physical that are willing to work in our favor if we align ourselves with their energies. Bringing ourselves into right relationship should be a constant, fundamental goal of practicing magicians because our magic is facilitated through our relationships in the more than human world. Relationality matters greatly, and our species' relationship with death in spirit is way out of balance. All we need to do, though, to change our relationship with death is to change our perspective, and the natural world provides plenty of examples for us to follow. Flowers exist to spread pollen around and bloom with great production to attract the pollinators, hoping for that one lucky visit, and then close around the germinating seed they contain to form the fruit of the plant. The flower petals dry up and fall off, having served their purpose, and not long after, the entire plant dries up and dies, releasing its seeds as a final biological imperative. The plant dies, but the species benefits, its seed spreading many hopeful plants worth of DNA as it expires. A multitude of life springs from the corpses of old forest trees, which eventually fall in storms or due to pests and other causes. They offer rich stores of excellent compost as they rot and decay, as well as habitat to many plants, animals, and insects along the way. There is an entire mini ecosystem which contributes to the reclamation effort of rotting trees that encourages the collective growth spurt that follows in its wake. Mushrooms grow in rotting tree stumps, converting the dense wood into edible nutrients for the local community of flora connected through the mycorrhizal network in the forest floor. Ants collect the carcasses of insects and other debris which falls to the ground, like the forest cleaning crew, as they quickly clear away any organic matter that might still be of value. Trees are perpetual growth machines, which draw nutrients up from deep in the earth with their long roots, and then use them to grow a large canopy, and then periodically shed their aging leaves in favor of new ones. When these leaves fall to the ground below, they begin to decay into what will eventually become nutritious compost for the same tree and the surrounding flora. Nutrients are never really lost, but simply stored in leaves temporarily, and then reclaimed through the regenerative cycle. Just as our bodies regenerate themselves, every cell, completely every 7 years, a tree loses all its leaves or needles many times over in the course of its potentially very long life. Leaves are optimal photosynthesis devices, evolved to capture light and moisture and to convert them into sugars which feed the plant and power its growth. They are particularly effective when they are new and diminish in effectiveness due to wear and tear over time. When their usefulness declines, they are dropped, composted, and the chemicals within them are eventually converted into new leaves to replace the old lost ones. Imagine if trees feared death as we do, if they clung to their old and ineffective leaves instead of shedding them regularly. Imagine if old trees could prevent themselves from toppling over indefinitely and no longer incubated the collective of insects, fungi, and other flora that feed on and thrive in their giant corpses. Forests, as we know, wouldn't be able to exist without the natural processes of reclamation and regeneration at work. Life could not exist without death. After all, what is dirt but death? The very soil of the earth is made from the decayed forms of our predecessors. We stand on the shoulders of many dead giants. We grow in the soil of their decay. All that grows, all that lives, owes its life to the death that comes before it, in an endless cycle of life, death, and rebirth. Compost is fascinating for this reason. We all share the same base chemicals in an infinite chain of possession, just passing back and forth the basic materials of life. These chemicals are combined in various ways to transmute energy and power biological processes, but they only change state. They're never created or destroyed by the processes that they facilitate. This illustrates beautifully how connected we all are, down to the molecules that we share in exchange. Compost is the one example of this reclamation process where humans haven't completely shit the bed. Organic gardeners got it right. Excluding the plastic, glass, and metal containers that purchased items come in, essentially everything else you consume can be composted in a relatively small area of space. And when you grow your own food, you plug into this wonderful natural cycle of endless reuse. What's more, with a little care, and a bit of chicken wizardry, you can rapidly repair damaged soil through simple, fast composting methods. An organic garden is a fascinating example of the resurrective powers of the life, death, and rebirth cycle at work, since if you do it right, you're improving the soil and making it more resilient against erosion while growing in it. But compost is the key. It's the essential ingredient. So we know this about reality, that death fuels life, even if we don't recognize it and take advantage of it often. Magically, there are plenty of examples of death fueling life, but the most obvious of which would be living sacrifices, right? The sacrifice of a living being, such as a chicken or some other small animal, ritualizes the essential truth that life requires death. Death is simply a means to reclaim spent resources, energy, so that they can be recycled. This is true of the big death for each of us, of course, and we reincarnate into this closed system again and again. Our energy doesn't go anywhere either. But this is also true of the little deaths, the metaphorical deaths that each of us go through repeatedly in the course of our lives. By practicing radical acceptance in these times of change, big and small, we can gain a power over them that puts us into alignment with the cosmos. We're capable of participating fully, intentionally, in this cycle of regeneration and benefiting from its powers of resurrection, just as we've learned the art and science of soil reclamation. But it requires adopting new rituals and practices to work this magic. Death is a powerful ally and the key to resurrection by reclaiming and recycling all the energy that we've spent living. Preparing ourselves for the big death by living our lives consciously and intentionally also means celebrating the regular little deaths, which enable our spiritual evolution, so that when we die, each time, big or small, we retain the lessons that we've learned while experiencing life without clinging to the impermanence of flesh and time. What we need is a way to compost ourselves regularly, perhaps even annually, to stimulate spiritual growth and physical restoration throughout our lives, like autophagy for the soul. Fortunately, ancient history is replete with examples of rituals marking the passage of time, as the seasons, and petitioning the gods, or often the goddess, for the regular renewal of life. From these, we can reconstruct the reasonable beginnings of a practice designed to help us evolve through our little deaths and prepare ourselves for the inevitable big death that awaits us at the end of this incarnation. And no less importantly, looking at the world with our new appreciation for death, it's easier to see where our modern society is out of whack and the many ways that we can work to bring ourselves into better relationship with the world around us. In particular, I've already mentioned our bizarre tendency to throw away the unused nutrients in our waste, nutrients which are a struggle year after year to resupply into the industrial agriculture systems which our food chain is dependent upon. And our only solution to this problem is to pump our growing fields full of enormous quantities of low bioavailability petrochemical-based fertilizers. And of course, the excessive runoff from this practice causes erosion and further soil depletion, and then dumps unconscionable quantities of these toxins into our water sources. Gross. But how does this relate to our fear of death? Well, it's all about control. Our need to mechanically control every aspect of reality, like the good little soldiers of the demiurge that we are, is driven by a fear of death, the ultimate resignation of control to the universe. Fundamentally, if you don't believe in a benign, intelligent universe, then the universe is a scary place that's out to get you. Your death is a big deal to you. Death is therefore universally bad and scary. This makes you averse to anything that might harm you or decrease your chances of survival. And after a time, this fear-based rationale extends to anything which might affect your way of life unpleasantly. We should be able to recognize the extreme version of this thinking present in our own culture today, on essentially both sides of every issue. And I suggest the root of this is fear, the big fear that drives all living creatures, the fear of death. The need to control everything is, at its root, an expression of the fear of one's own mortality. My energy healing practice has taught me that regardless of how many problems have manifested in a person's life, and I'm saying this about everyone on Earth, their issues will boil down to 3 or 4 significant root causes, which have become part of their identity. When this happens, people tend to bury their awareness of the issue in their subconscious, where it manifests in shadowy and self-destructive ways that reflect the underlying tension, but don't result in a useful, integrated understanding of it. Wounds fester and cause us pain so that we treat them. Without the pain, we'd ignore them indefinitely. This is true of physical cuts and scrapes, but it's also true of mental, emotional, and spiritual injuries, ancestral and past life traumas, and even generational and societal traumas we live through as a collective. The cultural fear or obsession with death present in the West causes the same set of collectively self-destructive behaviors. All of the absurdity of the modern world, its wastefulness, recklessness, and unsustainability, can be diagnosed simply as a form of self-destructive acting out caused by unprocessed collective trauma. This is exactly the sort of behavior that people exhibit when confronted with their darker selves. I think that this is why ancient peoples were so proactive about death. They didn't fear it, but they did plan for it, and they used ritual to harness its restorative, resurrective powers. Planting crops was accompanied by offerings for a prosperous season ahead, and harvesting was celebrated with feasts and animal sacrifices. Ancient people saw that the annual waning of the sun was accompanied by death in the winter, and that spring always follows the winter. This illustrates how death is required for life. The sacrifice, usually of a bull, was a gift of life force back to the earth as a symbolic trade, in recognition really, for the continuation of life in the future, the renewal or resurrection of the life lost to age, time, and decay. Oxidation happens to us all. To exist is to break down, slowly. That's why our bodies regenerate themselves, but even that in time is inefficient and unsustainable. We break down. The world and everything in it, and especially everything you know and love, are only here for a time, like a slowly disintegrating mandala. But this isn't the end of the story. Sandcastles are destined to fall and be washed away, but that doesn't keep us from building them. Mandalas are impermanent by design. So are we, as is everything. But whatever dies is reabsorbed by nature, when we allow it to be anyway, and reinvested into the future. Ego has us hung up on the idea that we disappear in death, and therefore it should be feared. But we die over and over again throughout our lives and are only better for it. Evolution happens in cycles of life and death through the genes of our species. Spiritually, we evolve through experiences we accumulate in life, and those lessons carry on into our next life. But every few years, I'll be reminded of what I was like at an earlier time in my life, and it is, without fail, always a shock how unrecognizable I was compared to who I am at the present. And last year, after 6 months of shamanic training and about a quarter of a year on either side of that adventure, it would be hard to overstate its revolutionary effect on me. I spent most of that year stirring up childhood traumas and making space for a new me to grow, because I realized that it is impossible to become the you that you want to be until you let the you that you are today die, a good death, and grow from the husk of what remains. The phoenix has to burst into flames to be reborn. From our ashes, we rise. And though it is a comparably big deal to reincarnate, it's far more economical to die symbolic deaths when you need to renew yourself and your grip on reality. Mock death rituals are fairly common in ancient traditions, mystery schools, and so on. The ancient Egyptians perfected resurrection technology, though, so we can rely on them heavily to get our bearings. Arnold van Gennep was a 19th century ethnographer and folklorist who essentially wrote the book on rites of passage, of which the passage from life to death is one of the most important. In his book, The Rites of Passage, Van Gennep sums up the Egyptian resurrection myth in this way. As Ra, the sun, the deceased dies each evening upon arrival at the edge of Hades. His mummy is thrown into a corner and abandoned, but the series of rites it undergoes during the night in the sun's barge revives him little by little, and in the morning he is again alive and ready to resume his daily journey in the light, above the world of the living. And then this essential bit here. The performance of these rites is in accordance with the general idea that the sacred, the divine, the magical, and the pure are lost if they are not renewed in periodic rites. Resurrecting our own rituals for the same. We can draw a lot of inspiration from this example, but I'll get back to that in a bit. What's really important to sit with right now is this idea of renewing our connection to the divine, the magical, and the pure by performing regular rites of renewal. What's also essential to understand about this framework is the shamanic connection between yourself and your environment. The relationality, the link between the two, demands that when one is suffering, the other feels pain as well. But when they are in right relationship, they are better and more resilient together. By working on ourselves, we affect the world around us differently, and it reflects differently as well, changing our experience of life for the better. But we don't get to be a new, more resilient version of ourselves without this evolutionary process, aging, dying, and being reborn again. The more we cling to who we were, the less we get to be who we are today, and the harder it becomes to realize who we can be in the future. And this drags the world around us down as well. Evidence of these rites of renewal comes down to us from about as far back as we have textual evidence of civilized people. Arguably, there are less concrete examples dating back into prehistory, such as the clearly calendrical orientation of Göbekli Tepe, which is suggestive of seasonal rites, i.e. rites of renewal. The form of these rites that persisted through time, that we can observe through the lens of history, is on a social scale. The actions of kings tend to be recorded more permanently than the average person, before we all had YouTube channels anyway. Gordon White's wild ride of magical history, Starships, written star.ships, connects the dots of a rough lineage for the Western esoteric framework, and this tale includes, of course, these rites of renewal. In Starships, Gordon writes, this notion of kingship descending from the stars, and the king going up to the stars to ensure immortality and the well-being of the tribe, is highly likely to be the origin of the hermetic and classic ritual magic we find in the grimoires, having come down to us through the dual routes of the Nile and the Fertile Crescent. And it's worth pausing here to dig in a little. Gordon's point is that the foundations of the Western esoteric system are themselves rooted in ancient Egyptian magic, which is of no surprise to the average occultist. However, Gordon continues by saying, in the explicit use of directionality, we clearly see the shamanic origins of a ritual designed to both appropriate and set right the entire universe. Viewed with the eyes of an occultist rather than an academic, we can spy the same exact ritual form present in Old Kingdom Egypt and Sumeria. By shamanic origins, Gordon means a pre-religious, decentralized spiritual tradition in which nature, the mother goddess, the elements, the sun, moon, and one's ancestors, and the spirits of plants, animals, and places are the important cosmological players. Safely, we can assume that these rites of renewal have been repeated by cultures and peoples across millennia, and likely tens or hundreds of millennia. So what did resurrection rituals look like in ancient times? Relying again on Starships as my lens for magical history, Gordon questions the idea that pyramids are tombs, and that the pyramid texts are solely funerary in nature. The pyramid texts, for reference, are described by Encyclopedia Britannica as a collection of Egyptian mortuary prayers, hymns, and spells intended to protect a dead king or queen and ensure life and sustenance in the hereafter. They were found inscribed on the walls of the inner chambers of pyramids at Saqqara, dating as far back as 2500 BCE, and they constitute the oldest surviving body of Egyptian religious writings available to us now. But according to Starships, Dr. Jeremy Nadler's Shamanic Wisdom in the Pyramid Texts presents a hugely compelling argument that what we call the Pyramid Texts, or PT, are related to the same spiritual function that underpins that the king, while living, passes into the afterlife and returns, the classic shamanic journey. And then Gordon makes the point by quoting the PT, I am Horus, my father's heir, Horus, the reincarnated son of the slain god Osiris. I am the one who went and came back. This pattern is echoed later in the Christian resurrection myth, which is a close parallel. Osiris is betrayed and murdered by Set, spends time in the underworld, and is resurrected after his mutilated body is reassembled by his wife Isis, the mother goddess archetype. After his resurrection, Osiris becomes the ruler of the underworld, and his son and heir, Horus, is born and eventually reigns over creation. We can squint a bit and see the pattern emerging. Osiris is slain by Set, is reconstructed and resurrected, and transcends his prior role while his evolved self takes over in the living world in the form of his son Horus. This might as well be describing a soul retrieval, a shamanic technique where a soul fragment that was lost during a traumatic experience is reintegrated into the greater self, and the prior, limited self is transcended completely. This is exactly the energy we're looking for. We just need to be able to tap into the power of resurrection without enduring the full-on death of the physical. Well, the Egyptians had the answer for this as well. Horus is a psychopomp, an intermediary between the world of the living and the world of the dead. In a sense, Horus reenacts his father's trip to the underworld, but instead of physical resurrection, he brings back the wisdom of the dead and the authority to rule the living. Reading now from Dr. Jeremy Nadler's Shamanic Wisdom in the Pyramid Texts. Elsewhere it is as Horus that the king rests in life in the west, i.e. the underworld, and then, like the sun, shines anew in the east. In both these passages, a non-funerary interpretation in which the king mystically dies by entering into and then returning from the realm of the dead is just as possible as a funerary interpretation. But however we interpret them, their existence is incontrovertible evidence that the dead king is not always an Osiris. Meaning that if the king isn't playing the role of Osiris, who now calls the underworld home, the king is Horus, inheritor of the throne of earth with access in and out of the underworld on demand. Let's close out our brief tour of Egyptian resurrection tech with another sample from Starships. The king is repeatedly exhorted to claim the throne of Osiris in ritual. Here the king not only departs alive, but he does so in order to claim the throne of Osiris and give orders to the living. His dismembered body is reformed as atum, meaning complete one, with the face of the god who presides over the comings and goings between the realms. As a result, the assembled forces and settlements of creation and destruction now serve him. So Horus, inheritor of his father's legacy and kingdom, gains the authority to rule, as do the human kings reproducing this myth and ritual, by passing through the underworld and bringing back wisdom and authority. There's a lot to unpack here that's useful for our reconstruction of resurrection tech. We can treat it like a template as we build our own practices. There is a metaphorical deconstruction of self, a death ritual, a grieving period, a reconstruction period, and then a story of a new self transcending and extending the old self. So the Egyptians were definitely doing this kind of self-work, practicing rites of renewal to elevate the self and thereby establish their divine right to act as gods upon the earth. Inspiring as this myth is, and as revealing as it is about the time depths these sorts of practices have come down to us from, the traditions of ancient Egypt feel too foreign for my sensibilities. However, I think we can take license from Narby's assertion that the Egyptian religious tradition had its roots in even more ancient shamanic ritual and practice. As a shamanic practitioner, of course, I prefer a free-form, metaphor-driven, nouveau chaos magic approach, so I was curious what equivalent practices I could find within South American cosmologies. My first thought was actually all the stories I've heard about the psychedelic eco-death experiences that feature dismemberment, usually in the form of being eaten by a giant snake or torn apart by some other animal totem. Ritual dismemberment was, of course, an essential part of sky burials and many other forms of ritual disincorporation. And I think this means that we can consider these big death, little death parallels evidence of our being on the right track here. Ego death, when triggered by psychedelic experiences, obviously has the opportunity to be traumatic, but it also has the potential to be mind-expanding and soul-awakening. This is the appeal, of course, but if the experience is not orchestrated well, you're just attempting a visit to the underworld without a guide, and this is what psychopomps are for. So in any case, we have better technology. Nevertheless, the psychedelic ego-death experience often includes this disincorporation dynamic, which is the destruction of your physical form to demonstrate the invincibility of your immortal soul, which is to say, removing your fear of death. Beyond ayahuasca lore and ego death, I was excited to find this abstract for a paper titled Yanomami Shamanic Initiation, the Meaning of Death and Postmortem Consciousness and Transformation, which relates the shamanic initiation of the Yanomami people of Venezuela and explains its meaning. During the initiatory ordeal, the neophyte undergoes an intense experience of death through dismemberment by the spirits and subsequent rebirth, thus overcoming the human condition and becoming an individual living spirit. But at the same time, he becomes a collection of other spirits who leave their natural habitats, located on the mountaintops and in the forest, and move into the initiate's body, which becomes their abode. As the candidate surrenders his soul and humanness to the spirits, the latter become his personal allies and sources of power. So the initiate visits the underworld and returns with new spirit-driven powers, which will stay with them for life and aid in their work as a shaman. This process contains the same familiar hallmarks such as dying metaphorically or visiting the underworld, deconstructing the self, integration of new elements, and resurrection into service. And of course, we can also take inspiration from the neo-shamanic tradition of soul retrievals, which reenact a similar process, visiting the underworld, negotiating for the release of a lost soul part, and the reintegration of this aspect through ritual and contemplation. Though this process is performed with a qualified partner, still, the shape of it is useful to consider. In a soul retrieval ritual in my tradition, the visit to the underworld is brief, including a petition to the ruler of the underworld, Huascar, to locate and release the participant's lost soul part and negotiate its return. To extract the soul part successfully, I have to help the participant to reframe their traumatic experience into a valuable lesson. Really traumatic experiences are best tackled with professional assistance, but this practice of ritual death and resurrection is something that should be regularly performed, for, as Van Gennep says, the divine, the magical, and the pure are lost if they are not renewed in periodic rites. Periodic rites lend themselves to calendrical rhythms, and the rites of the ancients went along with the seasons. This is the appeal of Eurocentric witchcraft, with the lunar calendar of sabbats and equinoxes, which orders both mundane and magical activity according to the seasons. But it isn't quite enough on its own to celebrate winter. We have to die shamanically, meaning performatively, ritually. But timing is probably relevant, so from these examples we can take the inspiration to time our little deaths according to the waxing and waning of the moon and the sun's route through the seasons each year. So let's review our exploration of this idea so far. I've highlighted separation and disconnection from the source and our subsequent fear of death as the root of all evils, in the sense that this fear causes us to try to control the world around us to the detriment of every living thing involved, but particularly ourselves. Our demiurgic attempts to dominate and control are a manifestation of a collective trauma which is trying to be healed. And we can take comfort in knowing that nature has many examples we can follow on the path to re-engaging with death, decay, and resurrection as part of the more than human community. We can follow the example of trees, constantly renewing ourselves and occasionally shedding our prior selves entirely to live long lives and die in service to the future. We don't have to look far for inspiration as we reconstruct our rites of renewal, as the roots of the Western magical system are fed by shamanic springs, seasonal rituals designed to realign flesh and spirit to improve and sustain the living world. Out of Mesopotamia and Egypt, of course, but probably also Old Europe and seemingly the ancient Americas, rites of renewal are essentially universal, though we can't be sure of their ultimate origin yet. For our purposes, it's enough to see the value in traditions that our species has kept for tens of thousands of years, if not more. Kings of Old Egypt annually reasserted their divine right to rule through a ritual reenactment and personification of the myth of Horus, visiting his father in the underworld to bring back wisdom and authority. In the same way, we can delve into the underworld to retrieve wisdom and the lost parts of ourselves which have been trapped within traumas, ours, our ancestral traumas, and even our festering cultural wounds. And by extracting ourselves from these destructive patterns, we are healing our environment, our relationships, and our ancestry, as well as working on ourselves. It all works together to bring us into right relationship, which allows the benign and intelligent universe to manifest the life you desire. To implement the magical resurrection tech that we've reconstructed here, we can lean on the lunar and solar calendars to find suitable times to plug in our rituals. Waxing moons are for growing and harvesting, not planting, so rituals for divesting ourselves of old energy, old stories, and old wounds are best performed under waning moons, or even better, a new moon. This provides a model and a schedule for maintaining the life, death, and rebirth cycles of land as well, which is of particular importance to those of us who own land and are trying to manage it respectfully. When harvest time does come around, offerings and whatever form of sacrifice you support, fasting for example, are an appropriate way to acknowledge the support of the divine and to demonstrate a little symbolic reciprocity. This completes the circuit and allows divine providence to continue to flow. Stewarding the earth through her seasons, as you live through the seasons of your own cycles. Your own life is a series of periods punctuated by little deaths and a lot of evolution, as you emerge into a new and improved version of yourself again and again. These cycles of metaphorical death and resurrection aren't really optional, but it is possible to lean into the evolutionary process, to engage with it intentionally, and in so doing, to gain the spiritual authority to command the living world. We do this work in the West, as it has always been done, from the Fertile Crescent to the jungles of the Amazon. Recalling the pyramid text again, it is as Horus that the king rests in life in the West, and then like the sun, shines anew in the East. And this is the magic that we're trying to reconstruct. We want to rest in life in the West, and then shine anew in the East. For my part, I'll be working on monthly rites of renewal timed with the new moon, where I already have a Hecate-related practice that this should fit right into. And annually, I'll probably insert a more significant mock death ritual. In my shamanic training, I was taught to use fire, blowing the parts of myself that needed to die into sticks, very intentionally, one by one, which I then used to build a fire. And I placed 3 of my kuyas, or healing stones, into the fire to charge them with this energy, transmuting the part of me that was cremated in the ritual into the stones, which are now a part of my mesa, or portable altar. Combining this ritual template with some of the next level tech that we've discussed from ancient Egypt and solar and lunar timing is probably where I'll go with this idea in my own practice. I'll be very interested to hear if any of you are inspired to incorporate rites of renewal in your practice after listening to this episode, or if you've already been doing this. Either way, I'm interested in anything which helps re-enchant our experience of life, and I see a tremendous opportunity to synchronize our modern traditions with the ancient practices of renewal which kept life in equilibrium, physically and spiritually, for many thousands of years in our distant past. If this is something you've already explored in your practice, I'd love to hear about it. Thanks for tuning in to this episode of the Postmugglism podcast and this sprawling discussion about natural cycles, right relationships, stewardship, personal evolution, and the magic of resurrection. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it on social media or send it to a friend that'll appreciate it. I am very, very grateful for anything that you can do to help spread the word about this show. For more of my stuff, videos, episodes, articles, etc. about magic, from astrology to dirt sorcery, visit my website and subscribe to my email newsletter at www.postmugglism.com. All right, I appreciate you spending your time with me today, and I'll see you in the next episode.